Hello, my little acorn crop. This is Hearses, transporting the dead and the undead through the ages. And yeah, that's Rick from season 8, I think, of Walking Dead, and the season where they had the CADILLAC mowing down the zombies. And before we dig in, it's a hearse, not a hearse. A hearse is a shifter. And I'm probably going to use coffin and casket interchangeably, although a coffin is the one that has 6 sides and sometimes is called a toe pincher. Now, as a hearse driver, you can imagine I get frequently asked, why, oh why, do I drive that thing? This is how it all began. There's a clip from an old movie that I've tracked down, and it's where this whole hearse thing started, and I'm going to divulge all the secrets. Now, remember back in the day when you recorded stuff off the TV onto the VCR? We even had what we called the clicker, which paused the recording while you were recording to edit out all the commercials. Well, we had one with like a 20-foot cord, I swear, and if my dad had to go to the bathroom, he would hand the dubious responsibility over to someone else. Well, one year at Halloween, this movie came on, and my father recorded it, and we watched this movie all the time. It could have been a week before Christmas, and we would be watching this particular movie. And this movie is Love at First Bite. In 1979, George Hamilton played Vladimir Dracula. And I don't remember when I first saw this movie.
You did real well, Renfield.
Thank you, Master.
A combination getaway car and mobile home. Now, when we get inside, I want you to play it real cold.
No, I believe that's real cool, Master.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah. We're going to make a hoist.
Heist,
Heist.
Master.
I'm sorry, we're closed.
We've come to make a withdrawal. We have a very sick man in the car who needs blood desperately.
But that's a hearse.
So maybe we're a bit late.
Look, I told you, we're closed.
So a hearse has always been a funny thing. Dracula's getaway car. I never found them creepy or scary. This is a 1975 Miller Meteor coach, probably fairly close to what they were actually driving in that movie. And the vehicles that we're talking about aren't necessarily called, or should be called, a hearse either. That's not the original meaning of the word. As you can see, hearse comes from the Middle English, from Anglo-Norman French, to harrow, a frame, from the Latin herpex, a kind of large rake, and oscan, herpes, meaning wolf, with references to the teeth. The earliest recorded sense in English is latticework, or can be placed over a coffin while in a church, and this is typically of a distinguished person, probably arose from the late Middle English sense triangular frame, shaped like an ancient harrow for carrying candles at certain services. Now, how did a word that used to describe a candelabra come to mean a car? That's a great question. So as long as humans have been alive, well, we've been dying. And I'm sure that our early ancestors discovered very quickly that you couldn't just leave a corpse in the middle of your living area and it needed to be moved. So the first innovation to corpse removal would be a litter, because I'm sure you can imagine 2 or more people can move a corpse faster and farther than just one. At the same time, though, our ancestors felt that the corpse needed to be honored, and thus more than one person might actually want to carry the body. So early man also prepared the body and decorated it with flowers and whatever they had on hand, so candles kind of come to mind. And now as human technology progressed, so did funerals. So flowers obviously weren't the only thing, neither were candles, but they still needed something to hold the candles, so thus they came up with candelabras. In the Renaissance, you will see full canopies erected over a coffin, such as this. I couldn't find this as a real picture, so we're going to have to deal with the next one here, which is St. Sebaldus in the St. Sebaldus Church in Nuremberg, Germany. Now, I'm not sure if that's large enough to actually be a coffin. It might be just a reliquary. Now, the thing about this is that the more important you were, the closer you were to the altar. So, like the closer to God. So if you're really important, you're actually interred in the church. Now, of course, if you were not quite as important as a saint or a king, they hauled your ass outside to get buried in the dirt. So again, we have to have a way to transport this coffin. So this is a more advanced version of a litter or a bier, and that still looks pretty heavy. So they put wheels on it, and now this was called a bier, which all it did was move the coffin or the casket. It was a narrow-wheeled cart, and interestingly enough, the floor of a modern hearse is still called a bier. Now, as cities grew and cemeteries became further and further away, it became necessary to utilize horse transportation. It made sense to place the coffin on a wagon to drive it to the cemetery. Enter the funeral coach. Now, the early funeral coaches were little more than what you see on the screen there. So it was a small cart like this that was pulled by a horse, and oftentimes the driver would have to straddle the coffin, and I'm sure that was probably pretty uncomfortable for him and probably somewhat awkward, because I think it would probably be rude and uncouth to actually sit upon the coffin. Now, some of the hearses were kept outside with the grave, such as this one, and then these ones were often thought to keep the undead from rising, but they could also be anti-theft devices. And if you look at the one on the right, there's little nubbies that look like they might be for candles. Now, just as ornamentation occurred in the church or cathedral and over the grave, the wagon became larger and highly ornamented. Thus, the mobile hearse was born. Now, before we progress too far, funeral directing in the early days was left to the cabinet maker or the livery stable owner. These individuals were to undertake the responsibility of creating a coffin and organizing the vehicles to convey the decedent and the family to the cemetery. This is how the word undertaker came to describe what we now call funeral directing. I'm sorry, I had to put that in there. And now with this one, you can see that on the left side it says furniture, and on the right side it says undertaker. Now, with cities growing in size and cemeteries being further and further, the wagons were employed more and more. Undertaking became a full-fledged profession, calling for supplies and education on how to prepare the body and organize a funeral. Now, with undertaking its own profession, they needed more coaches for different purposes. There were, of course, highly ornamented funeral coaches, but there was also often a coach for the pallbearers, the family, an invalid coach, which may have actually doubled as an ambulance, and there would be a casket coach that was used to pick up and deliver supplies, most notably caskets or coffins. You also would have an embalmer's buggy. In those days, the embalmer came to the house of the decedent and prepared them for the wake and the funeral, which also was all held at the house. Back then, we had a much more hands-on approach to death than we do nowadays. Now, prior to automobiles, trains and trolleys carried the deceased. Probably the most famous, at least in this country, funeral train was in 1865 for Abraham Lincoln. His body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, which was open to the public. Then the funeral train carried his body along with 300 mourners, an honor guard, and the body of Lincoln's son, and they traveled all around the country for viewing to the general public. And of course, when they stopped, a coach was used to move Abe's coffin. Now, at the time, a European method of embalming with creosote was used on his body, and the embalmer was even brought on the train to do touch-ups along the way. This embalming method essentially turned him to stone. Fun fact, Lincoln's coffin has been moved 17 times, and the coffin has been opened 5 times, and there was even an attempt to steal his body. But we all know that he went out slaying vampires. And yes, I watched that movie just so I could include that picture in this presentation. Now, as the motor car was coming into popularity, a livery operator found themselves with a fleet of horses and a fleet of automobiles. In 1909, the first motor-operated hearse made its appearance. A liveryman who had all automobiles also wanted to have a fully automotive procession and funeral. A quick-thinking gentleman by the name of H.D. Ludlow basically took the back part of a funeral coach or wagon and bolted it onto a bus chassis. Now, this is supposed to be a picture of Mr. Ludlow. I don't know if it is, but we're gonna say it was. Now, you might think that from there, the motorized hearse craze would have taken off. I mean, to us modern folk, hell yeah! Why would I want to take a horse-drawn funeral coach to the cemetery when I could go 10 miles an hour? I mean, at that time, that was astonishingly fast. And how pedestrian do we think that is now? It's pretty funny. Well, some people thought it was undignified to go fast, and horse-drawn hearses were basically a thing of the past. However, there are still some in service today, particularly in New Orleans, though in the end no one could stand in the way of progress and the automotive hearse has taken over. Interestingly enough, even Henry Ford helped the funeral coach industry. His new assembly line that reduced the cost to build a car made them affordable. So there were even Ford hearses, though they were typically not as ornate as some of the others. Now, this Model T from 1917 is fairly ornate, but you can still see it basically looks like a wagon bolted onto a chassis of a car. Fun fact, Fords came in any color, just as long as it was black. Even the Stanley steam cars were made into hearses. Anyone know why we don't use steam cars today? That's right, they tend to explode. Now that automobiles were made more affordable, more and more people were buying them, which would mean that more and more family members would be driving them in a procession. Now, this is pretty much what your first Model T would look like. And before we get too far, I need to mention combinations. If you ever hear a hearse person mention a combo, they probably aren't talking about lunch. Remember I mentioned a casket coach? Well, those were typically plain-looking vehicles that were used to run supplies around and pick up caskets. In 1910, the combo was born. This was a casket wagon that was made so it could double as an ambulance or a pallbearer's coach, or even a hearse in a pinch. You can be sure in small towns that this vehicle served these purposes. Now, the combination vehicle, along with the desire for the hearse to match limos, which were typically lower to the ground, and also the family cars were lower to the ground. So this led to a hearse that was more streamlined, and the wagon body placed on the bus chassis was a thing of the past. In later years, the combo was known as a vehicle that could switch between ambulance and hearse. Now, why would anyone want this? Well, for instance, an asylum. They would need to have both vehicles and could basically get two for the price of one. In more rural areas, the funeral director would run a livery, so to speak, and provide ambulances to the hospital along with limos for the family. A combo would be cost-effective for them as well. Now, I couldn't find a picture of a combo from 1910, so this one is actually from 1967, but you can see how easily it would be to make this one able to transport a gurney or a casket. The original 1959 Ghostbusters car was also a combo, and yes, I had to include it for those of you in the know. One of the more amazing hearse innovations in ornamentation took place in the 1930s, and that was the return of the carved panel hearse, which resembled the horse-drawn coaches of the past. As you can imagine, those panels are carved of wood. And yeah, this one finds its way onto my Facebook at least once a month, and yes, if I could, I would restore it and drive it, but the last I heard, the owner won't part with it. Speaking of things I want, did I ever mention I wanted a three-way? Ahem! A three-way hearse is one that you can load from either side or the back door. This was an especially great invention because it would allow the casket to be unloaded either way, so you didn't have to have a pallbearer step up over a curb while solemnly trying to carry and not drop a casket. There's a Y-track that moves the table. Early ones, of course, were manually operated, while the more modern ones would probably have an electric motor in them. Now, in the 1940s, when World War II hit, the civilian hearse production stopped. The ambulances, however, were still in production, and they went to the military and government agencies. After World War II, the carved panel hearses were no more, and the styling became much more simple and elegant, and the sexy landau came into production. Specifically, the curvy little S thing. The landau became the trademark of most hearses. The little S thing is supposed to resemble the hinged roof of a carriage, but as you know from earlier in this presentation, hearses didn't ever have that. Although I'm wondering if maybe the very, very first ones that the driver had to straddle, I wonder if they maybe had that, because I haven't discovered why the little S thing. Want to fuck with a newbie hearse owner? Tell them their Landau bars are on backwards. Hearses with glass all around are also known as limo style, and that one is a holy grail hearse. That's what I'm talking about. That's the one everyone wants. Now let's talk some frequently asked questions. Cadillac does not make hearses. The coach builder is a separate company, and if you've watched my previous video, you're probably familiar with some of these names, but some of the names are S&S, Sayers and Scoville, Miller Meteor, Eureka, Federal, Eagle, and most of those are located in Ohio. Crystal coaches, however, used to be out in California. So Cadillac or Buick or Lincoln would sell their largest sedan chassis to a coach company to build a hearse on. So basically, the coach company receives the front part of the vehicle along with a stripped back end of the vehicle, which is then typically chopped, and 17 inches is added to the body, about midsection, mid-rear door, and then they build out the hearse by hand from there. The reason the conversion is still done on sedan chassis instead of SUVs or vans, even though they have those ones, is that the sedans are lower to the ground and it's easier to get a casket in and out of them, especially if there are pallbearers. Cheap, but still want to drive the most unique car on the road? Get a hearse. They're still hand-built, and each one is different, especially the older ones. Do you need a special license to drive a hearse? Nope. All your passengers are dead already, so a regular driver's license is sufficient. This gentleman drives around with those 2 caskets in the back of his pickup all the time. And yes, anyone can transport a corpse. However, you need to have a special permit. In my state, it's a disposition transit permit to be able to move the body. This isn't hard to get. All you need is a certified copy of the death certificate. Now, am I a mortician? No, I am not. I do live with one, however. Am I in a band? Well, yes, I am, but I don't need an extra large vehicle to transport my instrument. I do know a young lady that's plays a full-sized harp, and that's why she drives a hearse. Am I in roller derby? I can't skate at all, so no. And how can I drive that? Well, it's very easy. I go out, put a key in the ignition, my right foot on the pedal, and it goes. Now, what's the gas mileage like? Well, I have a 2011 Jeep, and I have a 2014 truck, and the hearse is right between those. Is there a body in the back? Yes, I absolutely cannot get through my day without being in contact with a corpse in the back of my car. Of course not. But I am taking applications. Am I scared to drive it? No. Is it haunted? No. And the weirdest question I feel that I have been asked is, do I eat in there? Why, yes, I do. I also take naps back there when I'm at work. And lastly, yes, you can take it with you. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Good night, America, wherever you are.